Is the NHS broken? Is it overfunded? Is it underfunded? And does it work better than a privatised model? These are important questions to ask, and I get why they're being asked, but they're often very distorted in the media by people with vested interests, and it's really important that we actually talk about this in a reasonable way. So let's look at it. Question one, is the NHS broken? I think if you ask people working in the NHS at the minute, they'll tell you how hard it is. Not only because it's hard to work in the NHS anyway, it's always hard to work in these jobs where you're looking after people, where you're making sure the systems that are needed to look after people are in place. It's hard work, right? We know that. What feels different at the moment compared to, say, 15 years ago is the scale of the problem and the lack of the resources to fight it. So how many patients are on the waiting list, or how many patients and beds one nurse or one doctor are looking after, that's what's changed. And when we look at patterns of healthcare services around the world, the NHS used to be voted number one in the world. It was voted that by the Commonwealth Fund quite consistently over several years. And it used to be the envy of the world. People used to look at the NHS and the efficiency that it had, the outcomes it was able to deliver, and the value for money that we got back as citizens from the NHS were all like number one ranking in the world. And this is super, super important. When you look at healthcare systems, say in America, where they're not as efficient and they're not as good, what they are very good at is making money. Like, people make so much money out of healthcare in America because it's privatized, and that is the insurance system, that is the hospital themselves. It's a system where if you're inside, you are raking in money. But for citizens who use that healthcare, it's much harder, because if you don't have health insurance, you're screwed. People go bankrupt. People lose their houses because they've been unwell. People can't afford ambulances when they need them. Like, this is, so strange for people in Britain to think about, but the narrative is changing in Britain, and that's because there's a lot of people who would stand to profit if Britain started selling off its NHS, or, to be honest, continue selling off its NHS. Now, the reason I say continue is that actually large swathes of the NHS have already been sold off. About 10% of our elective surgeries are done through the private sector on the NHS. We've seen entire trusts outsourced to NHS, outsourced to private providers, and we are seeing more and more of this continue under Labour. It's gone up 20-30% since they came into power, the usage of private sector since they came into power 2 years ago. We've also got to look at private healthcare donating a lot of money to the big parties, Labour, Tories, Reform, because they've got a lot of interest in making sure that the NHS doesn't function so that it can be sold off. And this is the thing, it's intentionality. Like, if you want to privatise something, you have to first convince people it's not working, and the way that you do that is by throttling it of funds and starving it of funds that it needs. The second thing we've got to look at is obviously staffing as a resource. There is a shortage of nurses in the world, actually, not just the UK. There's a shortage of healthcare professionals. There is 140,000, vacancies in the NHS England alone, 40,000 nursing vacancies in NHS England alone. When you create a private sector, all that does is pull resources from one to the other. The people doing your surgery in a private hospital would be working in the NHS if they weren't pulled over to the private hospital. We've also then got to look at the limitations of that private hospital, because if something goes wrong during your surgery, you'll be sent back to the NHS, and the NHS will fix it up without any cost to the private sector, who are profiting from getting you into their hospital in the first place, which is caused by the backlogs and not having the staffing in the NHS hospital. And it's a cycle that perpetuates and makes things worse and worse and worse. So what we're seeing is a deliberate attempt to starve the NHS of funds and then blame the NHS for its own failures. And now this is happening across all mainstream parties, and that's what's really sad. Because the party that actually created the NHS, Labour Party, in a brilliant constitution and in such a inspired wave of creativity and genius and collectivity, they're the ones that have now turned their back on it. And Andy Burnham, who is going to be our next Prime Minister, was the Health Secretary who oversaw a huge rollout of PFI and Private Finance Initiative. Now, fair enough, afterwards, when he left power, he said, we shouldn't have done that, that was a mistake, but he still did it whilst he was Health Secretary. So it's not particularly great sign, him now becoming the Prime Minister. But overall, I think we're seeing the narrative change. Like, most people don't want a private NHS, but when you look on social media, all the bots are saying, privatise it, because that's an agenda that they're trying to push. Now, it's really important that we, as people who understand the NHS, we as healthcare professionals, dispel that information and say that actually the biggest threat to the NHS at the minute is underfunding. When you compare it to our European partners, say Germany or France, they've got different models, but they invest so much more money as a state in their healthcare than we do. So we've been putting in a deficit of about £40 billion a year for the last decade. That's £400 billion short compared to our European partners. That is a huge amount of underinvestment. At the same time, our pay for nurses and doctors is well below the average. So what we're seeing is a drain on resources as people leave to go and work in other places, or they get fed up, or they leave to try and work in other sectors or even other careers quite often because they're fed up of being overworked and underpaid. This is all a pattern that is moving us towards privatisation, and we take it for granted. I think, you know, a lot of people don't know what Britain was like pre-NHS, or they haven't lived somewhere that doesn't have an NHS and they're taking it for granted. There's a real risk here of losing our biggest national asset, and we will actually see thousands of lives lost, and we will see people go bankrupt, we will see our lives destroyed if we enable politicians to sell off our NHS. Now, Reform UK, Nigel Farage has been one of the biggest challengers of a public healthcare system for decades. He has spoken publicly about the need to sell off the NHS and have an insurance-based model. Now, he hasn't abandoned those views, and nor have the billionaires who are investing in him. You know, we've got 3 billionaires at the moment fighting to see who can give him the most money. I don't think they really are trying to preserve the NHS, and I think they'd much rather carve it up and share it amongst themselves. So it's really important that we continue to fight that and challenge the narratives. A couple of things that I can say that will help: join Keep Our NHS Public, keep up to date with them. Read Critical by Dr. Julia. It's a fantastic book that talks through NHS privatisation. And subscribe to my channel as well, because I'm going to be doing a little bit more on it. Subscribe to my Substack, subscribe to my YouTube, and I'll try and keep doing it. If you've got any questions that you want to talk about specifically around the NHS, join my Patreon and we'll be able to actually talk a little bit more and unpick some of those more complex issues. But this is something that's so important to all of us, and it's something that we have to unite on to make sure that we defend our NHS and that we save our NHS.